What happens when a simple act of flying first class becomes a public trial, when two bright, successful young women are judged not by their tickets, but by the color of their skin. This isn't just a story about a cancelled flight. It's a story about a system, a gatekeeper who held all the power, and the two black teenagers who were told they didn't belong. But the gatekeeper Karen Miller made one fatal mistake. She had no idea who she was talking to. She had no idea that the father these girls were about to call wasn't just any dad. He was the man who owned the very planes she was standing next to, and with a single phone call he was about to pull the plug on her career, her airline and flights across the entire country. Stay tuned as we unravel the shocking events at JFK and the devastating karma that followed. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 hummed with a unique kind of organized chaos. It was the Friday before a long weekend, a symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried announcements, and the palpable excitement of travelers escaping the city. For 17-year-old twins, Maya and Chloe Sinclair, that excitement was a tangible thing, a buzzing energy that made their steps light as they navigated the throng towards the Aurafly priority check-in. Their destination was a celebratory one, a week-long marine biology seminar in the Bahamas, a prestigious program they had both been accepted into. It was the perfect capstone to a stellar junior year at Brearley, one of Manhattan's most elite private schools. They were by any measure exceptional young women, co-captains of the debate team, fluent in French, and already holding provisional patents for a small water purification device they'd designed. They looked the part of modern, stylish teens. Maya wore a chic tailored blazer over a simple white tee and designer jeans, her box braids tied up in a high, elegant ponytail. Chloe, ever the more artistic one, had opted for a flowing linen jumpsuit, her own braids adorned with delicate gold cuffs that caught the terminal's fluorescent lights. In their hands, they clutched identical passports and first-class tickets on Aurafly Flight 825 to Nassau. Their father, Robert Sinclair, believed in rewarding their hard work. "You earn the best, you get the best," he'd always say. First class wasn't just about the legroom. It was his way of telling them their achievements, placed them in the front of the plane, and in the front of life. They found the plush red carpet of the Celeste class lane and joined the short queue. The agent at the counter, a woman in her late 40s, with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen Miller, was processing a businessman's documents with a practiced, almost robotic efficiency. When he was done, she looked up, her gaze sweeping past Maya and Chloe to the couple behind them. "Next!" she called out, her voice flat. Maya stepped forward, placing her and Chloe's passports on the counter. "Hi, we're checking in for Flight 825 to Nassau," she said, with a bright, polite smile. Karen Miller's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, flickered from the passports to the girls, then back again. A small, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between her brows. She picked up Maya's passport, her thumb rubbing over the photo, as if testing its authenticity. "Sinclair?" she murmured, her tone holding a note of something. It wasn't quite accusation, but it wasn't welcoming either. "And you're both in 2A and 2B? "Yes, that's right." Chloe added her own smile, unwavering. Karen tapped at her keyboard, her movements slow, deliberate. The silence stretched. The couple behind them shifted their weight impatiently. "I'm seeing an issue with these tickets," she finally said, not looking at them but at her screen. "An issue?" Maya asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "My father booked them directly through our corporate account last month. We have the confirmation email." "The system is flagging the payment source," Karen stated, her voice taking on a formal, unhelpful edge. "It seems irregular for this type of seating class." The implication, though veiled, was as clear as glass. 2 black teenagers in first class. The computer must be wrong. The payment must be fraudulent. The girls exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered this kind of subtle, coded suspicion, but it had never been so overt, so public. "I can assure you, our father's corporate account is perfectly fine," Maya said, her voice remaining steady, though a knot of frustration was tightening in her stomach. "Could you please just try running it again?" Perhaps it was a system glitch. "Our system doesn't glitch," Karen replied curtly. She pushed the passports back across the counter. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. I can't check you in. You'll need to go to the main customer service desk at the end of the terminal to sort out your payment." The main service desk was a snake pit of frustrated passengers with complex ticketing problems. It would take hours. Their flight boarded in 45 minutes. "But we'll miss our flight," Chloe said, her voice laced with disbelief. "There must be something you can do. Can't you call someone to verify it?" Karen Miller offered a thin, dismissive smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed the small dominions of power they were given. "Our policy is clear. I can't issue boarding passes for flagged tickets. Now please step aside. You're holding up my Celeste class passengers." The insult was a direct hit. "My Celeste class passengers." The message was clear: you are not one of them. The humiliation was a hot flush that crept up their necks. The people behind them were staring, their expressions a mixture of impatience and pity. Maya and Chloe, the girls who excelled at everything, who were taught they belonged in any room they chose to enter, were being turned away, treated like criminals in a gilded cage of their own making. And as they stepped away from the red carpet and onto the cold common linoleum, they knew this was no longer about a simple ticketing error. The area to the side of the check-in counter became a small, invisible island of shame. Maya and Chloe stood there, the flow of travelers parting around them like a river around a rock. The initial shock was quickly being replaced by a simmering anger. They had done nothing wrong. Their entire lives they had been taught to navigate the world with grace and intelligence, to overcome obstacles with poise. But how do you reason with a wall? This is insane. Chloe whispered, her phone already in her hand, scrolling furiously through the booking confirmation email. "Look, here it is. Confirmation number, ticket numbers, payment method. Sinclair, Aviation Capital Corporate Amex. It's all right here." Maya took a deep breath, marshalling her composure. She was the pragmatist, the debater. She would approach this with logic. She walked back to the counter, waiting for Karen to finish with the next passenger. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you again," Maya began, her tone meticulously polite. "But I have the confirmation right here. It shows the payment was accepted and the tickets were issued. Could you please just look at this?" She held out her phone. Karen Miller glanced at the phone screen for less than a second before waving a dismissive hand. "I don't look at passenger phones. It's a security risk. All I know is what my system tells me. And my system," she said, tapping a key with a sharp pointed fingernail, "tells me there's a problem." "Then your system is wrong," Chloe interjected, stepping up beside her sister. The injustice of it was making her tremble. "Can we please speak to your supervisor?" This, it seemed, was the ultimate offense. Karen's pale blue eyes narrowed into slits. "You think my supervisor is going to tell you something different? You think you can just demand to see a manager because you don't like the rules? We're asking to see a supervisor because you're refusing to help us solve a problem that your airline created." Maya countered, her voice firm but still respectful. "We are ticketed first-class passengers, and you're denying us boarding without a valid reason." The words first class seemed to trigger something in Karen, A sneer ghosted across her lips. "Everyone thinks they're a VIP these days. The tickets you hold are worth more than the car I drive. It's a red flag, girls. It's my job to spot them. It's called diligence." The accusation was now laid bare. They weren't just passengers with a ticketing issue. They were red flags. Young. Black. In seats they couldn't possibly have come by, honestly. The prejudice was so thick in the air it was suffocating. At Chloe's repeated insistence, Karen finally let out an exasperated sigh and spoke into a headset. A few minutes later, a man named David Brown arrived. He was a shift supervisor, a man who looked perpetually stressed. His tie slightly loosened his eyes, darting around, as if constantly looking for the next fire to put out. Karen spoke to him in a low, conspiratorial tone, gesturing towards the girls. They couldn't hear the exact words, but they could see the narrative being woven, the suspicious tickets, the demanding teenagers, their refusal to accept her authority. David Brown approached them, his expression one of weary resignation. He already looked defeated. "Ladies, I'm David Brown. Karen tells me there's an issue with your tickets." Maya calmly explained the situation for the third time, showing him the confirmation on her phone. He at least looked at it, but only for a moment. "I understand," he said, handing the phone back. "But I have to trust the system. And Karen is one of our most experienced agents. If she says there's a flag, there's a flag. Our hands are tied." "So what are you saying?" Chloe demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "That we're just supposed to miss our flight? Miss a program we've worked years to get into because your computer has a flag and no one is willing to make a single phone call. You're causing a scene," David said, his voice dropping. He was more concerned with the optics of the argument than the substance of it. "The best I can do is offer you a rebooking fee waiver if you can sort this out with customer service. But you need to lower your voices." That was the final straw. They were being humiliated, discriminated against, and now they were being told to be quiet about it. They were being policed for their own reaction to the injustice. A scene. Maya's voice was dangerously quiet now, the practiced calm of the debate captain coming to the fore. "You are denying us access to a service we paid for, based on nothing but your agent's baseless suspicions. You're publicly accusing us of fraud, and you are concerned that we are making a scene." Around them, the world had shrunk to the space of this confrontation. Other passengers were openly watching now. Some looked away embarrassed, others whispered to each other. A man in a cheap suit a few feet away had his phone up, discreetly recording. Karen Miller, seeing her supervisor back her up, felt emboldened. "David, they're becoming disruptive. Maybe we should call security." The word hung in the air, charged and venomous. Security. For two teenage girls asking to be let on a flight they had a ticket for. Chloe's eyes welled up with hot, angry tears, but she refused to let them fall. She looked at her sister, a silent communication passing between them. They had exhausted every option. They had been polite. They had been logical. They had been patient. And they had been met with a brick wall of prejudice, personified by a gate agent named Karen and her spineless supervisor, David. Maya nodded slowly, a cold resolve settling over her. "You know what?" she said, her voice clear and ringing in the sudden quiet. "You're right. We should make a call." She pulled out her own iPhone. She didn't look for the airline's customer service number. She scrolled through her contacts to Dad. As she pressed the call button, she looked Karen Miller directly in the eye. "You said you had to trust your system." Maya said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let's see who your boss trusts more." Karen scoffed, a look of smug disbelief on her face. "Go ahead. Call your daddy. See what good it does you." The call connected. "Dad," Maya said, her voice breaking just a little, the emotion finally cracking through her steely composure. "We have a problem." Across the city, in a glass-walled office overlooking Bryant Park, Robert Sinclair put his meeting on hold. The fear in his daughter's voice was a sound he hadn't heard in years, and it sent a spike of ice-cold adrenaline through his veins. Robert Sinclair was a man who moved through the world with an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He wasn't loud or ostentatious. He was methodical, precise, and possessed a mind that saw the interconnected architecture of business and capital in a way few others could. As the founder and CEO of Sinclair Aviation Capital SAC, he was one of the most powerful men in the airline industry, though most of the flying public would never know his name. Airlines didn't own their planes. They leased them. And SAC was the landlord for over 700 aircraft globally. They weren't just a leasing company. They were the leasing company. When he heard Maya's voice, the world outside his office door ceased to exist. He listened, his knuckles white, as he gripped his phone, his expression hardening from concern to a cold, focused fury. He heard everything, the condescending tone of the agent, the supervisor's bureaucratic indifference, the threat to call security on his children, on his daughters. He had spent their entire lives building a world for them, where their brilliance and character were the only things that mattered. He'd poured his fortune into their education, their safety, their future, all to protect them from the very poison that was now being dripped on them at a JFK check-in counter. "Put the supervisor on the phone," Robert said. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low-pitched rumble that promised a storm. Back at Terminal 4, Maya held the phone out to David Brown. "My father would like to speak to you." David sighed, an expression of profound irritation on his face. This was the last thing he wanted to deal with. "Mom, I am not going to speak to your father. This is between you and the airline." "He insists," Maya said, her gaze unwavering. Karen Miller laughed out loud this time. "Oh, for goodness sake, David, don't. They're just trying to intimidate you. Who's their dad, the president?" A dangerous glint appeared in Maya's eye. "Take the call," she said, her voice no longer a request. Reluctantly, David Brown took the phone, holding it to his ear with an air of condescension. "This is David Brown, supervisor with Aurafly. Who am I speaking with?" He listened. The smug look on his face began to waver. It dissolved, replaced by confusion, then dawning horror. His face went pale, then a blotchy red. The hand holding the phone began to tremble. "Mr. Sinclair, of Sinclair Aviation." David stammered, his voice suddenly a squeak. I don't understand." He listened again, nodding frantically, his eyes darting from Maya to Chloe with a look of pure terror. "Yes, sir. I see. No, sir. Absolutely. I will right now, sir." He handed the phone back to Maya as if it were radioactive. He was visibly shaking. "What is it, David?" Karen asked, her smile finally gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. David turned to her, his face ashen. "Let them through." He hissed the words, barely audible. "Print their boarding passes, first-class lounge access, everything, now." "But the flag..." Karen started to protest, clinging to the last vestiges of her authority. "To hell with the flag!" David shrieked, his voice cracking drawing stares from across the terminal. "Do you have any idea who that was? Do you—" Before he could explain, Maya's phone rang again. It was her damned. She answered and put it on speaker. Robert Sinclair's calm, measured and utterly merciless voice filled the space around the counter. "This message is for the supervisor, Mr. Chen, and the agent, Ms. Miller." The voice began as crisp and clear as a legal notice. "My name is Robert Sinclair. The corporate account you flagged belongs to my company, Sinclair Aviation Capital. A few frequent flyers in the line, those who worked in finance or aviation, visibly flinched at the name. It was like hearing the name Rockefeller at a bank. Aurafly. Robert's voice continued. Currently operates a fleet of 88 aircraft. Sinclair Aviation Capital is the lessor for 74 of them. That includes your entire fleet of Airbus A321neos that service your most profitable transatlantic routes, and the Boeing 737 that is supposed to be Flight 825. Karen Miller's jaw went slack. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a pasty, unwell look. She finally understood. She hadn't been questioning a customer. She'd been questioning the man who owned the very ground, or rather the air her company stood on. In our leasing agreement, Robert's voice went on devoid of any emotion, specifically in Clause 11. 3B, there are service-level agreements and brand integrity covenants. These covenants stipulate that our assets cannot be associated with activities that bring our brand or the brands of our partners into disrepute. This includes, but is not limited to, discriminatory practices by airline staff. David Brown looked like he was going to be physically sick. As of 2 minutes ago, I spoke with my legal team. I have also left a voicemail for your CEO, Mark Thompson, informing him that Aurafly is in material breach of this covenant. I am invoking Clause 28.5, the right to ground leased assets, pending an immediate investigation and resolution. This means, Mr. Chen, that every single Sinclair leased aircraft in Aurafly's global fleet is to be grounded upon arrival at its destination. No Aurafly plane leased from SAC is to take off from any airport worldwide, effective immediately. Silence. A profound, stunned silence fell over Gate B-26. The only sound was the distant tinny announcement for a flight to San Francisco. My daughters, Robert concluded his voice, now carrying a flicker of raw paternal anger, will be on their flight to Nassau. I expect a personal escort to the gate and an apology from you both. But make no mistake, this is no longer about a flight. You wanted to check a red flag. You just flagged the end of your airline's operational capacity as you know it. The line went dead. Maya switched the phone off. She looked at Karen, then at David. Their faces were masks of pure, unadulterated panic. Chloe, standing beside her, let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been annihilated. The gatekeeper had been dethroned. The plug had been pulled. And as the first frantic calls started crackling over David Brown's radio from operations, they all knew that the chaos was just beginning. The fallout was not gradual. It was a tsunami. Within 60 seconds of Robert Sinclair's call ending, David Brown's radio squawked to life. It wasn't the calm, procedural chatter of the flight line. It was a panicked voice from the Central Operations Control Center, OCO. All stations, message from the Director of Flight Ops. We have a code red. I repeat, a code red. All Aurafly departures are on an indefinite ground stop. Effective immediately. Acknowledge. David fumbled for his radio, his hand shaking so badly he could barely press the transmit button. Terminal 4 supervisor acknowledges. What's the nature of the code red? We don't know. The voice crackled back, frayed with stress. The order came from the top, executive suite, something about a breach of contract with a lessor. All call signs with an SAC designation in the registration are grounded. My God, David, that's almost the whole fleet. Karen Miller stood frozen, her face a grotesque canvas of disbelief and terror. She looked at the twin girls in front of her, no longer seeing them as troublemakers, but as the avatars of a destruction so complete she couldn't yet comprehend it. Suddenly, A woman in a sharp, dark blue Aurafly uniform came power-walking towards them, her heels clicking urgently on the polished floor. This was Eleanor Vance, the Terminal 4 Operations Director. She was known for her unflappable demeanor, but right now her face was a mask of controlled panic. "Chen Miller, my office now." She barked, not even glancing at the Sinclair sisters. Then she did a double-take, her brain finally connecting the dots. The two girls standing defiantly at the counter. The ground stop. The rumors flying over the internal network. She looked at Maya and Chloe with a new, horrified understanding. You're the Sinclair daughters." Maya simply nodded. Eleanor Vance's professional veneer cracked. "Oh, dear God," she whispered. She turned to another agent at an adjacent counter. "Get these young ladies' boarding passes printed. Escort them to the Celeste Lounge. Get them anything they want. Water, champagne, a new car, I don't care. Just do it." She then grabbed Karen and David by their arms, her grip surprisingly strong, and steered them towards the back offices. "You two have just torpedoed the entire airline," they heard her hiss as they disappeared from view. For Maya and Chloe, the experience was surreal. One moment they were pariahs, the next they were royalty. An obsequious agent, sweating profusely, handed them their boarding passes and profusely apologized for the terrible misunderstanding. They were personally escorted through security, bypassing the lines, and taken to the pristine, exclusive Celeste Lounge. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and luxurious, but the tranquility was a facade. Everywhere, business travelers were looking at their phones, their expressions morphing from annoyance to confusion. "Flight to Heathrow is delayed." "To what do you mean indefinitely?" "They're saying the same for the Chicago flight. Some issue with the planes." The shockwave from Robert Sinclair's call was spreading. On the departure boards across the terminal, the word "delayed" in stark yellow began to populate the Aurafly column. Then one by one they flipped to the blood red of "cancelled." A low murmur grew into a roar of collective frustration from thousands of passengers. Maya and Chloe sat on a plush velvet sofa, untouched glasses of sparkling water on the table before them. The victory felt strangely hollow. The humiliation was still a fresh, stinging wound. Watching the chaos unfold, the crying families, the furious businessmen yelling at staff, they felt a pang of something they couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Dad didn't have to do that? Chloe said quietly, watching a young boy press his face against the window, looking at a grounded plane he was supposed to be on. What else was he supposed to do? Maya shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. Let them call security on us. Let them get away with it. That woman Karen, she enjoyed it, Chloe. She enjoyed making us feel small. I know, but grounding the whole airline, affecting all these people, that's on them, Maya insisted, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. It's on Aurafly. They created the system that let a woman like that have that much power. Their flight 8225 to Nassau remained on the board, mockingly listed as on time. It was the only one. Their father had made it clear his daughters would fly, but their plane, a gleaming Boeing 737-800, was now an island in an ocean of paralysis. Meanwhile, in the Aurafly corporate headquarters in Dallas, CEO Mark Thompson had just gotten off the phone with a screaming Robert Sinclair. Thompson, a man used to smooth-talking his way through any crisis, was in a cold sweat. He had listened for 5 minutes as Sinclair laid out the events in cold, precise detail, concluding with a simple, brutal statement. Your brand is toxic, Mark, and you've allowed it to poison my family. Fix it. Now. Fixing it wasn't simple. The leasing contracts with SAC were ironclad, written by Sinclair's famously ruthless lawyers. The breach was undeniable. The grounding was legally airtight. Every minute the plane sat on the tarmac, Aurafly was hemorrhaging millions of dollars. They were losing landing slots, crew timings were being thrown into chaos, and their reputation was being incinerated on the altar of social media as thousands of stranded passengers began tweeting their fury. The problem at JFK was no longer a customer service issue. It was a multi-million-dollar, brand-destroying catastrophe. Mark Thompson slammed his fist on his mahogany desk. A gate agent, a single power-tripping gate agent in New York, had just brought his entire global operation to its knees. He buzzed his assistant. "Get me Eleanor Vance at JFK on a secure line, and get me the entire file, every last complaint and commendation on an employee named Karen Miller. I want to know everything, and I want her and her supervisor terminated. Not suspended. Terminated. As in their access cards don't work by the time I hang up this phone." The immediate fallout was swift and brutal for the two employees at the center of the storm, but for Aurafly, the bleeding had just begun. Robert Sinclair wasn't just demanding an apology, he was demanding a reckoning, and the price would be far higher than 2 jobs. The 24 hours that followed the JFK incident were a masterclass in corporate implosion. The story initially, a series of confused tweets from stranded passengers, began to coalesce into a coherent narrative. The financial press publications like the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg quickly pieced together the connection between the mass groundings and the notoriously private CEO of Sinclair Aviation Capital. Whispers of a personal incident involving his family began to circulate. For Mark Thompson, the Aurafly CEO, it was a waking nightmare. His day consisted of a series of increasingly desperate conference calls. The first was with his board of directors, who were watching the company's stock price plummet in pre-market trading. The second was with his legal team, who confirmed that Robert Sinclair had them in a legal vice with no easy escape. The third, and most humiliating, was a second call with Sinclair himself. "This isn't about Manuel Gaharo." Robert's voice came through the speakerphone cold as a final judgment. "This is about the culture of your company. I've had my team do a preliminary search. This isn't the first time your airline has had complaints of this nature. It's just the first time it happened to someone who could shut you down." He was right. The internal investigation, spearheaded by a terrified head of HR, unearthed a damning file on Karen Miller. Over her 12 years with the airline, she had accumulated no fewer than 14 formal passenger complaints. The language in them was chillingly consistent. Agent was dismissive and rude, seemed to target minority passengers, created a hostile and accusatory atmosphere. She was the subject of 2 internal reviews, but both times she had been defended by her union representative and given a mere slap on the wrist. She was efficient, rarely made mistakes with baggage handling, and was seen by mid-level managers like David Brown as no-nonsense. Her prejudice was an open secret, dismissed as a personality quirk. David Brown's own file showed a manager who consistently gave high marks to problematic employees and resolved every complaint by offering a travel voucher, never by addressing the root cause. He managed up, not down. They were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a diseased corporate culture that prioritized on-time departures over human dignity. While the executives scrambled, the human cost of the decision was unfolding in airports across the globe. Aurafly planes that landed in London, Paris, and Tokyo were towed to remote stands and put into indefinite lockdown. Thousands of vacation plans were ruined. Critical business meetings were missed. A medical team was stranded in Chicago, unable to get to a conference where they were scheduled to present groundbreaking research. The stories of collateral damage began to flood the news painting Robert Sinclair not just as a protective father, but as a ruthless oligarch holding the public hostage. Then the video dropped. The man in the cheap suit, who had been filming at JFK, a freelance blogger named Kevin Richardson, had captured the entire exchange. The video, a shaky 10-minute clip, was a masterpiece of escalating tension. It started with Maya's polite inquiry, showed Karen's dismissive waves, Chloe's rising frustration, David Brown's weak-willed defense of his agent, and the chilling threat to call security. The audio was clear. Every coded insult, every microaggression was there for the world to see and hear. Kevin Richardson posted it to Twitter with a simple caption, "Young black women harassed and denied boarding by Aurafly staff at JFK. They said they were calling their dad." I don't think the airline realized who their dad was. Aurafly, they're flying while black. The video exploded. Within 3 hours it had 10 million views. It was picked up by every major news network. The court of public opinion, which had been starting to sour on the billionaire who grounded an airline, swung violently back in the Sinclair family's favor. Seeing the twins so poised and well-spoken, being treated with such contempt, struck a deep nerve. Pundits, celebrities, and activists weighed in. The incident became a national conversation about systemic racism and corporate accountability. Aurafly wasn't just an airline with a logistics problem anymore. It was the new face of American prejudice. The video also sealed the fates of Karen Miller and David Brown in a way that a simple termination never could. They were not just fired, they were infamous. Their faces were everywhere. Amateur internet sleuths found their social media profiles, their addresses, their personal histories. They became villains in a story that had captivated the nation. For them, the real karma had just begun. For the Sinclairs, the video was both a vindication and a violation. They were safe in the Bahamas, the seminar all but forgotten, as they were holed up in their hotel suite, watching the story of their humiliation play out on CNN. Robert felt a grim satisfaction that the world now saw what his daughters had endured. But seeing their faces, their vulnerability broadcast for millions to dissect, filled him with a fresh wave of protective rage. The power he had wielded was absolute, the consequences immediate. But now the story had a life of its own. He had started a fire to protect his family, but the blaze was now a wildfire, burning through the lives of thousands of people and threatening to consume the very concept of privacy and proportion. He had won the battle decisively, but as he watched the faces of angry, stranded passengers on the screen, a new, unsettling question began to form in his mind. What would be the cost of winning the war karma when it finally arrives is rarely the clean, satisfying event people imagine. It is often a messy, brutal, and complicated reckoning. For Karen Miller, life became an inescapable prison of her own making. The day after the video went viral, her full name and address were leaked on a notorious online forum. Her quiet suburban life in Queens was shattered. Her house was besieged by news vans. Protesters occasionally gathered on her sidewalk holding signs with her own sneering face on them. She received death threats by email, by phone, and in letters stuffed into her mailbox. Her husband, a city sanitation worker, was harassed at his job. Her son was bullied at school. She became a pariah. When she tried to find new work, even in fields outside aviation, her name was a scarlet letter. The moment a hiring manager Googled Karen Miller, the story of JFK would flood their screen. The viral video became her digital ghost, haunting every application, every interview. The union that had protected her for years quietly disavowed her actions and refused to handle her wrongful termination suit, calling her conduct indefensible. Stripped of her power, her job, and her anonymity, she found herself in a world that saw her not as a person, but as a meme, a symbol of petty tyranny and racism. The small kingdom she had ruled from behind her check-in counter had crumbled, leaving her buried in the ruins. David Brown's fate was less dramatic, but equally devastating. He was not doxxed or publicly protested, but in the corporate world his name was now poison. He was the manager who failed upwards, the man who stood by and did nothing, the supervisor who enabled bigotry through sheer cowardice. Every potential employer saw him as a massive liability. His career, built over 2 decades of careful, risk-averse maneuvering, was over. He had to sell his home, pull his kids from private school, and take a job managing inventory at a big-box store, the corporate ghost of his former life haunting his every waking moment. He had stood with Karen, and so he fell with her. For Aurafly, the karma was financial and existential. The grounding lasted for 36 hours, a lifetime in the airline industry. By the time Robert Sinclair agreed to let the planes fly again, the damage was catastrophic. The direct cost of cancellations, passenger compensation, and crew rescheduling ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The stock had lost 30% of its value, wiping out nearly $1 billion in market capitalization. But that was only the beginning of Robert Sinclair's price. In the settlement to avoid a protracted brand-destroying lawsuit, Aurafly was forced into submission. Sinclair didn't want their money. He wanted to rip out their corporate culture by the roots. The terms were brutal. 1. Lease renegotiation, SACD, terminated the leases on the 20 most profitable Airbus A321neo aircraft, effectively gutting Aurafly's lucrative transatlantic business. They were immediately leased to a competitor, Delta Airlines, in a move that was a public slap in the face. 2. Mandatory retraining. Every single one of Aurafly's 15,000 employees, from the baggage handlers to the CEO, was required to undergo a new intensive racial bias and de-escalation training program. The program was not to be designed by Aurafly's HR department, but by a third-party diversity and inclusion firm, hand-picked and paid for by Sinclair. 3. The Sinclair Foundation. Aurafly was forced to make a $50 million donation to a new charitable foundation established by the Sinclair family. The foundation's mission to provide legal aid and support for people who have faced discrimination in travel and hospitality, but lack the resources to fight back. 4. A public apology CEO, Mark Thompson, had to issue a full unreserved public apology, not in a press release, but in a televised address where he personally named Maya and Chloe Sinclair and detailed the unacceptable conduct of his staff. Aurafly survived, but it was a shadow of its former self, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the country. Yet the most complex karma was reserved for the Sinclairs. While they were championed as heroes by many, a significant and vocal minority painted them as villains. The narrative of the out-of-touch billionaire who punished thousands of ordinary people to settle a personal score gained traction. On talk radio and in online comment sections, Robert was decried as an elitist who used his financial power like a nuclear weapon when a scalpel would have sufficed. The twins found themselves at the center of this debate. At school, they were treated differently. Some classmates lauded their courage, while others whispered that they were entitled for even making the call. They received hateful messages online, accusing them of being spoiled brats who couldn't handle a simple inconvenience. One evening, back in their Manhattan penthouse, Chloe was scrolling through an article about a family that had missed a grandfather's funeral because of the Aurafly grounding. Her face was pale. "Did we do the right thing, Dad?" she asked, her voice small. Robert Sinclair looked out at the glittering expanse of the city skyline. He had won. He had protected his children and punished those who wronged them. He had forced a corporation to confront its systemic failings. But the victory was tainted by the knowledge of the widespread disruption he had caused. He had fought a monster, but in doing so had created waves that drowned innocent people. "We did what we had to do to be heard," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Power that isn't used to protect the ones you love is worthless. But power has a cost, girls, for everyone, and we are not immune to it." The hard karma had hit Karen Miller David Brown and Aura Fly like a freight train. But a different, more subtle karma had returned to them as well, the heavy, complicated burden of their own power and the unintended consequences of wielding it. They had won justice, but they had lost their innocence in the process. A year can seem like a lifetime. In the silent, churning world of consequences, 12 months was enough time for stories to curdle into legends, for wounds to either scar over or fester into permanent infections. The JFK incident, as it came to be known in aviation circles, was no longer a headline. It was a case study, a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted the corporate halls of Aura Fly and the quiet moments of the Sinclair family. The most visible legacy was born not in a boardroom, but in a sunlit office in Midtown Manhattan, the Sinclair Foundation for Equitable Travel. The $50 million extracted from Aura Fly was its seed capital, but its soul came from Maya and Chloe. They had deferred their college acceptances for a year, a decision that initially worried their father, but ultimately made him prouder than any Ivy League pennant ever could. They were determined to build something tangible from their humiliation. Maya, with a ferocity that surprised even her father, became the foundation's driving force. Her path to law school was now set in stone, but this was her real-world internship. She oversaw the creation of a legal rapid response team, a network of pro bono lawyers ready to intervene on behalf of travelers facing discrimination. Their first major case involved an elderly Sikh man, Mr. Anant Singh, who was barred from boarding a flight on another budget airline in Chicago because a fellow passenger had reported him as threatening for wearing his turban. The airline, citing its right to refuse service, had offered him a refund and sent him away. Maya took the case personally. She flew to Chicago, sitting with Mr. Singh and his family, for hours listening to his quiet, dignified account of the shame he felt. "They looked at me as if I was a disease," he told her, his voice heavy with sorrow. Using the foundation's resources, Maya didn't just file a lawsuit, she launched a strategic assault. Chloe, stepping into her role as the foundation's creative conscience, produced a short, powerful documentary about Mr. Singh. It featured not only his story, but also interviews with other Sikh Americans pilots, and even a former TSA agent weaving a narrative about identity prejudice and the symbols of faith. The video, professionally produced and heartbreakingly intimate, was released in tandem with the lawsuit. It went viral overnight, the airline facing a PR nightmare that mirrored Aura Fly's settled within a week. The terms included a public apology to Mr. Singh and the implementation of mandatory cultural sensitivity training, with a curriculum co-designed by the Sinclair Foundation. For Maya, the victory was more satisfying than any debate trophy. She wasn't just winning an argument, she was recalibrating the scales of justice. Robert Sinclair watched his daughters with a mixture of awe and introspection. The raw, brutal power he had unleashed to protect them had been a blunt instrument. They were now learning to wield that same power with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. His own transformation was quieter, more internal. At a board meeting for Sinclair Aviation Capital, while negotiating a new 100-plane lease agreement with a major European carrier, he insisted on the inclusion of his new corporate social responsibility clauses. "Robert, this is unnecessary," argued a board member, a grizzled veteran of finance named Lawrence Mills. "Our business is asset management, not social engineering. We'll get a lower yield if we tie their hands with these ethical covenants." The Robert of a year ago might have agreed, but now he saw things differently. "Larry." He began, his voice calm but unyielding. "Our assets are 300-ton billboards that fly at 500 miles an hour. They are symbols of the brands that operate them, and by extension they are symbols of us. We have a vested interest in ensuring our billboards aren't used to broadcast hate or incompetence. Last year taught me that brand integrity is not a line item. It is the bedrock of long-term value. The covenants stay, or there is no deal." The boardroom fell silent. The covenant stayed. He had learned that true power wasn't just the ability to punish, but the foresight to prevent the crime from ever happening. The reformation of Aurafly was a far more painful and public affair. CEO Mark Thompson had survived, but he was a changed man. The televised apology had been the most humbling moment of his life. He had stood before the world and admitted his company's systemic failure. The subsequent retraining, mandated and overseen by Sinclair's chosen firm, was brutal. The sessions were like corporate therapy, forcing employees to confront uncomfortable truths. In one such session in a drab conference room at DFW Airport, a senior pilot with 30 years of experience stood up. "I just don't see what this has to do with me," he said, his arms crossed. "I fly the plane. I don't care who's in the back, as long as they follow the rules. This is a problem for the gate agents." The facilitator, a sharp, perceptive woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, nodded. "Let me ask you this, Captain. If you saw a flight attendant being needlessly aggressive with a passenger during boarding, what would you do?" "I'd tell them to knock it off and get the flight out on time," he answered. And what if that passenger was a person of color, and the aggression seemed racially motivated? Dr. Sharma pressed. The captain hesitated. That's a tough one. It's not my place to—" "It's everyone's place," Dr. Sharma countered gently. "A culture isn't just what you punish, it's what you tolerate. The silence of good people is what allows a Karen Miller to thrive for 12 years. The cockpit door doesn't absolve you of the responsibility for the culture on your aircraft." A quiet understanding rippled through the room. It was a long, arduous process of turning a massive ship, but, degree by painful degree, it was beginning to turn. For Karen Miller there was no ship to turn. There was only the endless, stagnant water of her new life. She now lived in a small apartment in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and called herself Janet. The severe blonde bob had been replaced by a nondescript, shoulder-length brown cut she did herself with kitchen scissors. Her life was a sequence of silent, lonely rituals: the walk to the bus stop in the pre-dawn gloom, the 8-hour shift at the Gas and Go, the bus ride home. Her kingdom was no longer a bustling airport terminal, but a cramped booth smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. The power to ground a flight had been replaced by the power to void a transaction for a bag of chips. One night around 3 a.m., a young black man, probably a college student, came in. He bought a Red Bull and a pack of gum. When he swiped his card, the machine beeped, declined. He sighed in frustration. "Man, I just got paid. Can you try it again?" A year ago, Karen's mind would have leaped to a dozen conclusions: fraudulent card, insufficient funds, another red flag. The old familiar sneer would have formed on her lips. She would have enjoyed his small moment of embarrassment. But tonight, she just looked at him. She saw not a statistic, not a threat, but a tired kid trying to get through his night. The ghost of Karen Miller, the JFK gatekeeper, rose within her, whispering its familiar, poisonous script. He's probably lying. Tell him to get out. Instead, the woman named Janet simply nodded. Sometimes these machines are slow to catch up with the bank. she said, her voice a monotone husk. "Let's try it again." She ran the card a second time. It went through. "Thanks," he said, grabbing his items. "Appreciate it." He left, and Karen Janet was alone again in the fluorescent hum of the store. It wasn't a moment of redemption. She felt no warmth, no sense of having done a good deed. She had simply done her job. But for the first time, she recognized the old impulse, the cruel little thrill of power, and had consciously chosen not to act on it. There was no one to see it, no one to praise her for it. It was a silent, meaningless victory in a life that had been stripped of all meaning, that she thought as she wiped down the counter was the most bitter karma of all. Not the public shame or the loss of her career, but being forced to live day after day with the hollowed-out person she had become, forever haunted by the ghost of who she used to be. The echo of her own cruelty was the only company she had left. The story of Maya and Chloe Sinclair is a stark reminder that the systems we navigate every day are only as fair as the people who run them. It's a story about the ugly face of prejudice, but it's also a story about consequences. Was Robert Sinclair's response an act of justified paternal protection or a stunning abuse of power? He brought a global corporation to its knees to right a wrong done to his children, but in the process, thousands of innocent travelers paid the price. Where is the line between justice and vengeance? This story forces us to ask ourselves some difficult questions. What would you have done in his shoes? And what can we do when we witness injustice, but don't have a CEO to call? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was the father's response justified? Did the karma fit the crime? Your perspective matters in this conversation. If this story moved you and made you think, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps the channel grow. And if you want to hear more real-life dramas that expose the fault lines in our world, make sure you click subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.